The reality is the Jewish community has a major fascism problem. The idea that I would identify with the person running the torture concentration camp because they're Jewish, as opposed to the people in it, that is the Zionist assumption. Anti-Zionists align with people of the global majority, with people who are struggling against fascism globally. Zionism is absolutely crumbling amidst this Holocaust. To not make Jewish allyship more important than anybody else's solidarity. Jewish people, I think, get way too much credit. We have not done enough.
Palestinian lives at stake here, Palestinian freedom, which has been suppressed for nearly 100 years now.
Zionism has destroyed Judaism to most people.
When we look back on this moment in the future, we are going to see this also for the moment when Zionism fell.
It is only through the uprooting of settler colonialism globally, including occupied Palestine and Turtle Island, in which all people will be free, including Jews. And that requires the end of Zionism.
Hello and welcome to episode 127 of the Palestine Pod. I'm one of your hosts, Lara E. You might know me from Instagram as @GazanGirl, and I'm joined by my co-host, Mikey B.
What's up, y'all? Mikey B on TikTok, Michael Schertzer on Instagram, and you can call me Mikey Intifada if you brought somebody on TV to defend rape.
Before we get into today's episode, please like, comment, subscribe if you hang out with us on YouTube. If you're listening on a podcast app, subscribe and leave a review. As always, you can find our full episodes and sources on PalestinePod.com. And if you want to get involved in the conversation, reach out to us at PalestinePod@gmail.com and give us a follow on Instagram @ThePalestinePod. You can also find us on Patreon, where you get early access to the Palestine Pod episodes. You also get an additional podcast per week. It's called the Patreon Pod. It's a little more laid back. We talk politics, Palestine, pop culture. We get a little more personal. And we are also hosting our monthly Zoom happy hours with our Patreon subscribers only. So really exciting stuff. Check us out on patreon.com/PalestinePod. Today's guest is Amanda Gelender, a Jewish anti-Zionist writer based in the Netherlands.
Thank you so much for having me.
I don't know if you saw the episode that we did with Rabbi Shapiro. It's one of our most popular episodes, almost 200,000 views on YouTube. And people really like it because he brings a perspective that I think many people have never heard. And that is the perspective of somebody who is speaking with authority from the perspective of Orthodox Judaism, but who can very clearly and simply explain to you with a tremendous amount of knowledge behind him why Zionism is an invention, and in his words, why and how Zionism has stolen the identity of Judaism. But one thing that Rabbi Shapiro says that we kind of maybe disagree with him on is this notion, at least maybe I do a little bit, and maybe Michael, you can let me know what you think, is this notion that there is no reason to say, as a Jew, I disagree with what Israel is doing, or as a Jew, I don't support this policy, or I don't support this state. He says that reinforces Zionism because you're saying, as a Jew, meaning that there is something inherently Jewish about Israel and that therefore you are standing up against it because you're a Jew. And he says that makes absolutely no sense, and that only reinforces Zionism, and that the only way to dismantle Zionism is to not speak up as a Jew because this project has nothing to do with Judaism. But I also think that the problem is that most people don't know that, right? And so in order for people to understand that, they need somebody, a Jewish person, somebody with authority on Judaism, to say that has nothing to do with Judaism. Don't be fooled. So I'm curious to get your views about this. Is this something that you've obviously made the choice to speak up in support of Palestine, in support of Palestinians? Do you do it as a Jewish person, or are you doing it as a human, realizing that no, this has nothing to do with that? Do you have some thoughts on that?
And really quickly, as a Jew, no, I think that it does have something to do with Judaism. I think it's not fair to say that it has nothing to do with Judaism, right? Because Jewish people are carrying out colonization. There's Jewish supremacy from the river to the sea. It is Judaism that gets you on the VIP list to the airport as opposed to put into a checkpoint. Yes, I understand what he means, where he's like, we don't want to reinforce Zionism by acknowledging it and saying as a Jew. I think it's just pretentious to say as a Jew anyways, because you should just be doing it because it's the right thing to do. And then also when people find out more about you and they find out that you're Jewish, they can understand that is your investment is in reclaiming Judaism and separating it from Zionism, which has destroyed the public face of Judaism to most people. They've publicly tried to claim Judaism as their reasoning for colonization. I've felt compelled to speak up. And then people have found out that I'm Jewish. Anyways, what do you think, Amanda?
Yeah, it's such an interesting conversation. If Zionism had stayed a fringe fascist part of Judaism, then okay, right? But because it aligned with Western imperialism in the way that it did, and it has now, 100 years or so into its colonization of Palestine, essentially become a cancer that has taken over the entire community, or almost the entire community, and that many Zionists are indeed enacting their Judaism through the Zionist project. That is like a deep identification. And like you said, Michael, the way that it's like we can't ignore the material reality on the ground of the way that Jewishness plays into this. But to me, Israel is the one that has centered Judaism. Like that is who set the standard for the centering of Judaism. So to me, it is the more important thing is to not make Jewish allyship more important than anybody else's solidarity. Like the risk more is in replicating the hierarchy in our own solidarity by saying, oh, it's more important when Jewish people speak out. No, it's not. And Palestinians don't need Jewish people to speak out. This idea of like they need absolutely not. Zero Jewish people could support this movement. It would still be just, righteous, and successful. And Jewish people, I think, get way too much credit. Like in general, I think that we have not done enough. And so there is, I think, this elevation of Jewish people in solidarity over other people. And I think that's dangerous. So I consider my Jewish, it's like, it is one part of what I bring. Please, if it's useful, then it's relevant. If it's not useful, then it's not relevant. It's as important as it is to the aims of the Palestinian liberation movement.
I fucking love you, dude.
Same. You have such a way with words. My God. What is your day job? Like, how does your brain?
What are you, a speechwriter for hope?
Yes, exactly.
It's very funny. I appreciate you guys. I appreciate it.
I'm curious to know if you personally, because I feel like in everything that I have seen of yours, I haven't yet come across your like personal story. I'm just curious to know if you are somebody who went through a process of unlearning or if this is what you were taught from a very young age. And if you did go through that process of unlearning, what can you say to people that are going through it now? Because I know that I understand everything you've just said about Palestinians don't need Jewish voices to have a successful liberation movement. And I agree with that. This is Palestinian lives that are at stake here, Palestinian freedom, which has been suppressed for nearly 100 years now, our self-determination, which has been non-existent. And it is the pattern of things to see the US, Europe, Israel, Arab states making decisions about Palestinian life and future without our input, or if our input is solicited, we are literally last in the list when they should not even be part of the conversation. And the only decision or opinion that matters is Palestinian decision making. Palestinian society as a whole is the only way forward in terms of determining what our future can look like. I do think, and this is going back to your point about if it's valuable to Palestinians, then yes, do think it is interesting to see many people on this path of unlearning. And this has happened, unfortunately, in concert with this live stream genocide. And I think that when we look back on this moment in the future, we are going to see this also for the moment when Zionism fell and the lies crumbled. It was no longer able to sustain itself. The propaganda was not working the way that it used to. And so if you can just shed light on your own personal background, aspect of this story, that would be great.
For sure. So I grew up in a progressive except Palestine community in California. Yes. And my whole family was activists. So my parents were both activists. And I learned about white supremacy and colonization and imperialism. I learned about all that very early. I did not learn about Palestine. So for me, and I was very active in the Jewish community. I mean, very, very active. I was in like a klezmer band, I was like, summer camp counselor. I was very active. So I got all of that Zionist indoctrination, through all of my interactions in the Jewish community. And then when I went to college, I was doing labor organizing, and one of the student activists broke it down for me. And she happened to be Jewish, but she wasn't raised as active in the Jewish community as I was. And yeah, she broke down what's going on in Palestine. And I did not know about the Palestinian struggle at all. But I had the system of understanding to plug it into. Like, I could recognize it immediately for what it was, a project of colonization. So, and it's so glaring, and it's such a extreme injustice that I became an activist immediately. And this was around 2006, 2007. And so that student and she's a writer, her name's Charlotte Silver, she's amazing. We started a Jews for Justice in Palestine chapter, and we worked with a great coalition on a divestment campaign. For me, it was like I learned about it. And immediately I was in, because to me, it's like, how could you not? It was, and the fact that I had gone that long as an activist and that it was able to hide in plain sight in a so-called progressive community, that's deeply disturbing. And I understood then, like, yeah, if it can hide out in these spaces, there is an even deeper level of urgency to act on this, because it's not just what we say, like, okay, Jewishness is a shield. It's like, no, white supremacy and colonization, wearing a kippah, like acting oppressed.
Wow. That is so amazing, and kind of similar to my awakening as well, where I'd already been questioning US empire. I was walking around telling my friends, like, everything's being recorded by the NSA. This was before Snowden, so it wasn't a popular opinion back then. Got a lot of people telling me that I was giving off whistleblower vibes. And then, like, it was yours actually is nicer because you just like sat down and had a conversation, but they tortured me, and then I got a little bit of like what they experience, when they handcuff people and then like blindfold them, and then that was a part of my awakening.
Yeah,
yours sounds kind of nice, actually.
Without the context, it just sounds like you were tortured.
I mean, legit, they threw us in a room for like hours, and like,
yeah, it was a hazing thing in college. It was,
yeah,
it sounds like you were at the airport.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Oh, do people not know my story? It's like, I mean,
people do.
do people who listen
not.
to this podcast are like
Amanda
unfamiliar with what
this.
radicalized me? Like,
I know the story. Our listeners do too. Amanda may not know. That's all.
I do.
Okay.
Yeah, let's stop pretending people don't know who I am.
The story is, okay. I learned about it. I've never seen a moment like this when it comes to Zionism. Zionism is absolutely crumbling amidst this Holocaust. And it's because of the power resistance and because of the steadfastness of the Palestinian people. The conversations we're having are in some ways the same as the ones we were having 18 years ago in a lot of ways. So I think what I see is that, this isn't going to be won in the hearts and minds of Jewish people. That's not where this is going to happen. It's going to happen on the battlefield. And I think that the fact that will also liberate Jews from Zionism is a gift to us, even if most Jewish people don't see it yet.
It's a gift that many Jews are fighting against. They're fighting against their own potential liberation from this Zionist occupation, from the brainwashing of Zionism. And right now, the occupation is drafting the Orthodox Jews into battle because they've lost so many people on the battlefield. So like, they're so short on people to send into this death cult that they are drafting the Orthodox Jews now. Is anybody noticing that the occupation of Palestine is literally sacrificing Jews at this point? Like, is anybody noticing that? Is that like not clicking for anybody? Is there any like nobody who's noticing that like, oh, this evangelical Christian support for Zionism to bring about an end time is actually like kind of coming to fruition through this occupation? I don't know. Sometimes I feel like if I was just outside saying this, people would think that I'm like I need to be like hospitalized, you know, or like 5150 like but because I have a podcast and a microphone, people are like, this guy's got some good points.
Well, I mean, look, it's the point we raise often, which is that Christian Zionist support for the state of Israel is not out of the goodness of their hearts. There's something deeply sinister about it, and the fact that Netanyahu is willing to, and all previous leaders are willing to go appeal to those aspects of American society and don't find it troublesome in the least to rub elbows with them is deeply troubling, I think, for the notion that they should represent all Jewish people on earth, because that's what they say, right? They say that they're the state of all the Jews, even the ones that are not there. And, when you see people like Pastor Hagee, scary people, they've got millions, people like him have millions and millions of followers in the US, and their devotion to the so-called, state of Israel is really nothing more than this like apocalyptic attempt to sacrifice half of them, a third of them? What is it that happens?
Jews,
2/3 of them?
and then 1/3 convert is their strategy. Like that's what Christian evangelicals truly believe, and that's how I know that they don't know Jewish people. Like we would burn in hell before losing an argument. Okay, get out of here.
Zionism, making alliances with people who hate Jews and people who, in general, are supremacists and colonizers. I mean, I think one of the things that made Zionism so interesting is that it was one of the first solutions, quote unquote, to European anti-Semitism that agreed with anti-Semites. Yeah, Jews don't belong here. Which, of course, it's one of the many reasons why European Jews were like, get the fuck out of here. What are you talking about? I live here.
Right.
I'm from here. I'm Ashkenazi. Like,
Right.
I'm from here. Okay. I don't know what you're talking about with leaving. And so they agreed with the logic of anti-Semites. That has always been the premise. Anti-Zionists align with the wretched of the earth, with the people of the global majority, with people who are struggling against fascism globally. It's more of a Bundist model. It's saying that, Jewish people are not separate. There's not a separate bubble of anti-Semitism that exists outside of other systems of oppression. It is only through the uprooting of settler colonialism globally, including occupied Palestine and Turtle Island, in which all people will be free, including Jews. And that requires the end of Zionism.
Damn, that's the clip right there, huh?
Yeah, Christian Zionists are wild, man. They're really wild, and the fact that anybody would knowingly align with a group of people that are not interested in your actual safety because it's strategic it just shows how disingenuous the project is at its core for being one that is allegedly, dubs itself as being representative of Jewish people or Judaism.
Yeah. And let's talk about where hostility for Jews could come from in a world where this occupation is claiming to be synonymous with Judaism. Like, oh, why is it that like people could be upset with Judaism and then you literally only know Judaism through the barrel of a gun? Yeah, dog, that's not Judaism is the thing. That's Zionism. And the only like people who can be blamed for confusing or making confusion about the two is the occupation of Palestine, which has disseminated years of propaganda claiming the synonymity of Judaism and Zionism, has claimed to speak for Jews, has claimed to be the representative for Jews in public culture for years.
Not anti-Semitism to not enjoy oppression. It's not anti-Semitism to want to be free. It's not anti-Semitism to not agree with being bombed at 5 a.m. while you're displaced in a school that's no longer functioning as a school because we're 10 months into a genocide and there's no more functioning schools in Gaza because all the universities have been bombed by Israel and the students are all out of school and they're all displaced in sweltering tents and they're, all starving and now they're all living in schools. And when they all wake up at 4 a.m. to go pray the morning prayer, then they get hit with 3 U.S. missiles that are dropped by Israel. And the fact that Palestinians would not hate this treatment is a weird ask by the US and Israel. Like the fact that we're supposed to have any reaction to this except to reject it wholeheartedly and to insist on freedom, unconditional freedom, as the only possible future. It's wild to me that they think that we would feel any other sort of way about it. And the fact that we don't just accept it and we don't just lay down and die, that they would try to frame that as anti-Semitism, it's actually insane, right? We don't hate our oppressors because of what religion they profess to follow, whether or not they actually are following that religion, right? That's also a matter that's up for debate.
Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro has a few words.
Right, exactly. We hate the oppression and the oppressors because of the treatment, because of the oppression, because of what they did, because they stole our land, because they stole our homes, because everything that they're doing right now in Gaza, they already did to our grandparents during the Nakba of 1948. And they've continued to do it. And now they have advanced weapons technology to do it faster, to create more carnage, to be able to do, to be able to multiply exponentially the destruction and the killing. But they had already started doing all of this, well over 75 years ago. We don't talk enough about how Palestinian reaction to the treatment, their lived experience, their material reality on the ground that is fashioned and created and perfect, and designed intentionally by Israel, that no Palestinian can escape from, whether they are on the ground or in forced exile, that their reaction to this is perfectly logical, human, and that to ask them to do anything but reject this would be the inhuman ask that nobody would be willing to do. But for some reason, we expect Palestinians to do it when nobody would ever accept the treatment that Israel hands out for us, for themselves.
Absolutely. It's a psychic assault, constant. And I love what Laura Sheehy talks about when she talks about how this demand for normalization is this constant psychic assault on Palestinians, this demand to submit. And I think that it's so infantilizing and insulting to Palestinians, the idea that if it was not Jews, that they simply just wouldn't resist. It's absolutely ludicrous, truly sickening and disgusting tactic to try and make Palestinians submit to occupation, which you're right, no person would ever do if occupation came knocking on their door.
And it's inconsistent with Jewish history, right? You have people who are saluting the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and then talking about, we need to nuke Gaza. Like, it's an extreme whiplash from one side to the other. And so you have to understand that if you support any uprising anywhere, as you should, as you would support Nelson Mandela, as you would support Nat Turner, as you would support the Warsaw Ghetto, then you ought to see correlation here in Palestine.
Absolutely. The idea that I would look at the situation and identify with the person who is running the torture concentration camp because they're Jewish, as opposed to the people in it, that is the Zionist assumption around alignment. That it's just like, it's a straight, it's Jewish. It's Jewish. That to me is one of the core differences between anti-Zionists and Zionists. When you see the situation, who are you identifying with and why?
They're like, hey, the people running the gas chamber have kippas. Isn't it obvious
Exactly
whose side you're meant to be on? So the guy who is a rapist and is caught on video raping a Palestinian detainee and is now going on like a media tour to defend himself and his unit. I literally forgot what I'm talking about because of how disgusting this is.
You were about to make the point that he took the mask off and he put the kippah on.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Yes. Okay.
For
So
the
this
raping.
guy on his media tour takes off his ski mask and then puts on the kippah. And that's like a really good metaphor for the occupation, where it's like they've just got done defending rape publicly that they did. And now they're gonna like throw on Judaism, throw on the costume, cosplay as Jews, right? And then try and garner support for their own crime. Like, did he start a GoFundMe? It wouldn't surprise me if this guy already is like a member of Knesset now.
The reality is the Jewish community has a major fascism problem, a major and widespread fascism problem. What waves is this making? Where is the Jewish leadership? Where is the real Jewish leadership that is actually calling this out, that is meeting the moment in terms of anti-colonial struggle, in terms of a Holocaust, that is providing it's nowhere to be seen. I mean, it's clear that this has taken over the faith almost entirely, and that Zionists are praying to their own Zionism, truly.
Yeah, that's such a great point. There are very few role models for us in modernity, right? Obviously, there's a long history of anti Zionist Jewish struggle, but right now it's few and far between.
Thousands of years before Zionism existed, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
Amanda, where do you think they are?
I think that there are several levels to this, including the fact that a lot of the folks who say that they're anti-Zionist are not. In terms of still normalizing Israel, in terms of not supporting the resistance, in terms of a lot of things. And so I think that we are planting some seeds for the next generation of Jews. I think that even if there's just a handful of us right now, that's enough. That's enough. I mean, not enough in terms of the Holocaust and in terms of the Palestinian struggle, but in terms of Judaism moving through this moment into the next, into Judaism beyond Zionism. Even if there's just one of us, it's enough. I mean, like, in terms of what can make it to the next generation, this moment is who people are. And this is Jewish history being written as Jewish people executing a Holocaust. And that's what's happening now. As Jewish people, fascism has almost eaten the whole thing. There's a few not, but that's where we are. And we will need to, in the generations to come, understand what reparations look like, because accountability is going to be so, so key. Because no, Jewish people are not meeting the moment. I care more about that than I do about Judaism surviving this, but will, because the Palestinian people are going to take down Zionism, not because Jewish people are even a supporting character in this, in my opinion.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you said about how Palestine doesn't need us. Like, so many people try and center Judaism or anti-Zionist Jews and Jewish people's feelings, and it's like, literally shut the fuck up. Like, nobody cares, and we've heard it before. It's unmoving and it's irrelevant. And if you're not talking about Palestinians on the ground, Palestinian prisoners, the entirety of Palestine being occupied as a whole, and the right of return of refugees, like, you're just not really talking about what matters.
Can I get your views on the election? Do you think that Kamala Harris is going to pull this off and convince the uncommitted people to vote for her, all the while straddling the line between full-blown genocide support? One of her top advisors, I think, came out and said that no, absolutely not. Arms embargo is not on the table. Apparently, after she had met with some uncommitted individuals earlier that evening and apparently told them that it was on the table. And then not even 6 hours later, someone from her team said, no, it's actually not.
She said, oh, it's on the table, not this table, not the table that we're sharing, but it's on a table somewhere.
I believe I read this on Mondoweiss. She had a meeting with them. In this meeting, she told them an arms embargo or cutting or conditioning or limiting arms, something along those lines, was on the table. She goes to her Michigan rally where she has this explosion at the protesters who interrupt her speech. She does her I'm talking thing. Then a few hours later, one of her advisors comes out and says, actually, no, an arms embargo is not on the table. So we don't know what they're talking about. And then she keeps flying around and trying at once to appease, AIPAC and the Israel lobby, and, at the same time get the votes that she needs from the Arab and Muslim population, because we can make you lose Michigan, and we will. It's happened before. Arab American voters in Michigan will determine the outcome of who wins, because Michigan can go both ways, and we are a significant population in that state. And we have the power, like we did, in prior elections, to determine the outcome. We are the reason that Bernie Sanders won and Hillary Clinton did not. So I'm curious to see if, what your thoughts are. Do you think she's going to be able to pull it off? Or do you think that the Democrats are finally going to learn a lesson here, which is that genocide is not going to get you to win elections just by the threat of the other guy winning?
I think this is all theater. I think what she says, all of this, it's like, I thought we already learned this lesson with Joe Biden and his ice cream cone, I thought we learned that we don't care what they say. They're not going to stop. To me, Israel is as much a part of the US as Texas is. Israel is America.
I would say
They're
more, actually, because Texas, there's parts of Houston that don't even have power. They would never let that happen to the Zionists. They would send backup generators from Texas to occupied Palestine in the event that somebody complained that they were uncomfortable.
Absolutely. They would never do Israel like that. Absolutely. The Democrats are Zionists. What I think a lot of Americans do is they make this artificial separation between domestic issues and international issues, like as if the global South cares who is dropping these bombs. And so I think that party is ruthlessly imperialist, but fundamentally the US is a settler colony, and they don't want to reckon with that. And the US is absolutely leading this ideologically, militarily. The US, Israel is just, an extension of US empire. So it's good that this is being faced. What's really needed is an immediate arms embargo and sanctions.
Yeah,
That needs to be the focus. Ceasefire means nothing.
100%.
They just assassinated the negotiator. If it wasn't clear before, it should be clear now. But ceasefire doesn't mean anything. It's become a buzzword. Netanyahu's
Hey,
not going to do it.
what does it mean for ceasefire negotiations when you assassinate the other person? Is that a good thing? Is that how you move your way forward?
It's also interesting because people don't really pay attention to what Netanyahu says. But if you pay attention to what he says, even if there's an agreement, we're not going to pull out of Gaza. We're not going to stop dropping bombs. So it's like, what does that even mean? Even if there's a ceasefire agreement, we're not going to cease fire. What does that mean? He's said this multiple times now. And, the Western political and media class, they just ignore it as if it doesn't exist. It's like the same thing that you see when the US goes on record time and again saying, it's our policy, the two-state solution is our policy. It's always been our policy that that's the only solution. Now, the only way you can get to that is through negotiations. If that doesn't work, well, tough luck. That's the only solution, and that's the only way you get to that. Now, that's a whole separate conversation about why that doesn't work. But it's like what they do with that, because they'll say that that's their policy. And then Netanyahu or Israel or whoever the leader du jour is will say there will never be a Palestinian state. And now it's actually codified as part of law in Israel, right? But they've been saying it for decades in any event. And so, but the U.S. will still come out on record and say, no, it's our policy. The two-state solution is our policy. How can that be your policy if Israel is saying it will never happen? And they have just made that a law.
A Holocaust is not going to end with a signed deal of okay, we're going to stop it. It's not going to happen like that, which is why I think that a lot of the efforts, like a petition for a ceasefire, it's we need to move beyond that. That is not going to get us where we need to go anymore. And this is where I think we need organizations that have resources, energy, and membership to really catch up with reality, and to stop undermining the armed resistance on the ground, because they are the ones who are actually presenting a threat to this Nazi Zionist Holocaust regime. It's in teaching people what anti-Zionism is while normalizing Israel is a big problem. And so when you defang anti-Zionism and remove it from material reality, which is land back, like real material restitution, understanding that yes, it is birthed through armed resistance on the ground, understanding those things that most nonprofits don't want to touch at all and will avoid that at all costs. Instead, again, they want to move more electoral. They have whole electoral units, which will put them directly at odds with Palestine organizers. And I think we saw this in the moment with Jamal Bowman and AOC and within our lifetime, which was protesting their endorsement of Biden. And meanwhile, you had progressive, anti Zionist organizations that were campaigning for them, put them directly at odds. This is such an important thing that you're going to see because there is this gap. There is a major gap between what is primarily white, Jewish, liberal Zionists and people who are doing real grassroots organizing that is Palestinian led.
And it happened especially when Joe Biden stepped down, right? We got a whole new wave of people who were like previously for Palestine, but then immediately at the first chance, they abandoned the cause to go back to brunch.
I think one of the most impactful organizing efforts has been the student encampments in terms of the US. And I think one of the reasons why they were so successful, that they were doing more of organization, not mobilization, in the words of like Kwame Ture, and something that Dr. Muhammad Abdu at Columbia University discusses. He's one of the professors who was like named in Congress, but he worked really closely with them and they were taking over land. You know, they were saying we're creating this temporary autonomous zone, and that threatens the settler state because that's not just showing up to an action. They're starting to build alternatives, a liberated zone. That's very threatening. That's more threatening people showing up to a place and leaving and showing up and leaving. Because we're not just talking about dismantling, we're talking about building. And we saw students start to build these alternatives. And we saw the violent reaction to the state from the state immediately. And so that's where I've seen some of the most successful organizing in the US in this last, 10 months.
Yeah, they were building radical community at the encampments. I went and I toured the UCLA encampment and I saw that they were providing medical services. There was food. Obviously, there was like people who were doing political education and outreach. It was people were mobilizing people's brains in addition to feeding their souls. And yeah, you're so right that when it's like just an action that you go to, you show up, you go home, you know what I mean? You go back to whatever you were doing and then you kind of like rinse and repeat it. Like it's not as sustaining. It's not as effective as showing up to a place, a physical encampment, and then learning and growing from that environment.
And it's also interesting because, as it turns out, they find occupation very threatening.
The irony of Zionists being like, you can't camp here, bro. Your whole thing is camped. Your whole thing is camping. You're camping all over Palestine. Like we didn't forget the tents that you brought to blockade either.
Yes. The student encampments provided healthcare, food, education, community support, mental health services, music, art, all sorts of things that really are the heart of what, community is. And when the Zionists had their, turn at an encampment, we've seen them do this for months now. They camp outside of crossings and they block the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza, and they bring their children and they have these raves. There's very bizarre music at them. I mean, there's no education happening. It's just full-blown fascism, and justification for why these Palestinian families in Gaza should starve to death.
Yeah, the only books that are at those gatherings are being burned.
So, yeah, I just was wondering if you had any comments about those bizarre things that we've seen. We've seen a lot of bizarre things, I think, in the last 10 months, about the society as it functions or dysfunctions. And one of them is the encampments to block humanitarian aid. The other is the pro-rape protests, outside of the torture facility. There's plenty of others. Maybe now's a good time to list some of them off.
The reality is their grandparents did this too. They've been squatting on this land, depriving aid, being sadistic. This is their shtick. This is Israel. Israel has never had a spotlight on it like this, but this is Israel. And anyone who tells you this is an aberration of Zionism or Israel is lying. This is exactly, like you said, this is what their grandparents did. They know. They know what's going on. And they're bringing their kids because they want to teach them.
Yes, and nothing is weirder than watching, the documentary Tantura and seeing like 90-year-old Zionists who are like 2 inches away from the grave, chuckling, laughing about how many Palestinians they killed in 1948, how they raped a Palestinian girl who was like 16 years old in the village of Tantura, how they dug mass graves and put people, Palestinians in them alive. They're literally like about to meet their maker. And it still hasn't dawned on them that they have dedicated their entire life to evil, to oppression.
Absolutely.
Like your legacy is oppression. Your legacy is literally the oppression of another people whose lives have been destroyed because of your actions. Like how do you live with yourself? Well, I guess they lived with themselves perfectly fine, because in the documentary, and if anyone hasn't seen it, I encourage you to see it, they laugh about it. It's funny, and then when they say, well, how many did you kill? Well, I don't know how many I killed, a couple hundred. This is the way they talk about it is so haunting. It's so disturbing. But that's what that's what that generation did. And then everything that flows from that, because it's never been reckoned with, is only going to get worse. And it has.
Absolutely. And the Zionists projected the image of the Nazi onto indigenous Palestinians and then have just ran with it for a century. They delight in this sadism, and it is a project that has always been destined to fail because it's built on death. It's built on nothing. And what's disgusting is how successful their barbarity is, even if they're successful in nothing else than barbarism. And how many people have had to die for this disgusting project to continue over the years. But luckily it's dying because it can't succeed. But it really is just settler colonialism in 4D. I mean, it's exactly what happened on Turtle Island. It's exactly what's happened. This is a blueprint that is so old, being played out, down to the tropes, the mass rape hoax, just down to these very specific tropes about indigenous people defending their land, and all the things that the colonizer will say as they try to do that. Yeah, it's, Zionists came to this colonial project late. I mean, it's a script that goes so much farther back, I think, that we're seeing play out.
Is there anything you want to talk about that we haven't talked about? Like there's so many things to talk about, but is there anything that you'd like to bring up? I'd like to maybe give you that chance.
No, I don't think so. This has been great.
Amanda, thank you so much for being our guest here today on the podcast. We so enjoyed talking to you, and we so enjoy your presence online. Keep up the great work.
I appreciate you guys so much.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda.
Have a great day.
Folks, that's been another episode of the Palestine Pod. Go ahead and check out our full episodes and sources at www.palestinepod.com. Follow us on Instagram at The Palestine Pod. Send us an email at palestinepod@gmail.com. And consider supporting us on Patreon, www.patreon.com/PalestinePod. That's been another episode of the pod. Thank you all so much for listening. Have as good a day as you can.
We can start telling people to join the Patreon. The show wouldn't be possible without a Patreon. You got to get on our Patreon. Support us on Patreon. You can, because I've been watching all these other podcasts and they just keep plugging Patreon like all the time.
Yeah, I'm going to clip what you just did right now.
Okay.